good to be here again this year. I think I've been here about 17 or 18 of y'all's 23 years, and I'm just so proud to have gotten to be a part of it all along. Many years ago in Ireland, there lived a man whose name was Brian O'Bronican, and the job that he had was to cut rods, weave baskets of them, and then sell them wherever he could sell them, in Findlay or in Dunlap, or wherever he could find a market for them. Well, the day came when there were no more rods to be cut. There were no more baskets to be woven. And he'd spent all the money he'd made. So it was hard times. In fact, the English were in power, and it was hard for an Irishman to get a job at all. But one day his wife says to him, she says, "Brian, I've heard there's a bog over at Alton Tor, and if you go over there, you might find some rods you could cut and make some baskets and sell them." And Brian says, well, I've heard it's a fairy bog, and if I cut rods over there, why, something bad might happen to me. "Oh, well," she says, "maybe if you just cut enough for 2 baskets, nothing very bad will happen to you." You can see she loved him very much. So the next day she made him a lunch, and he went off over to Alton Tor, and he cut himself 2 bundles of rods, bright and early in the morning. And when he got up to leave, why, a great wind came up, and it lifted him up, turned him around, and set him back down, and he said, "Oh, I better not go home yet. I'll eat my lunch, and maybe the wind will be past." And so he sat down, and he ate his lunch, and he stood up, and wouldn't you know it, that wind picked him up again. It picked him up and twirled him through the air and set him down right in the middle of a deep, dark forest. Well, he looked to the right and he looked to the left, and there was a light. And so he headed for the light, and when he got there, it was a little cottage, and the door was wide open, and inside he saw a little old man and a little old woman whom he'd never seen before in all his life. And yet they called him by name, Brian O'Bronican. They said, "Come inside." And that he did, and he sat down. And the little old woman said to him, "Well, now, Brian, have you a story to tell?" "Oh, no, I haven't got no stories. I haven't got no Finian tales, nor no Cthulhu tales, nor nothing like that." And the little old man said to him, "Well then, Brian, why don't you go fill this bucket with water for us?" And Brian said, "That I can do, but I can't tell a story." And so he took that bucket and he went out to the well and he filled it up with water and he set it down on the flagstone. And just as he did, a great wind came up and it picked him up and carried him up and away and set him down right in the middle of the deep, dark forest. And he looked to the east and he looked to the west, and there was a light. "Well, there's a light, there's people," he said, and he headed for the light. And sure enough, he got there. It was a house a little bit bigger than the first house he'd come to, and the door was open, and he could tell it was a wake house. You know what a wake is, don't you? In Ireland, if somebody dies, the friends get together and they stay awake all night long, and they drink and tell stories of the person who died and so forth. And so Brian knew it was a wake house because there was a row of women along the back of the room and a row of men along the front of the room. And up at the end, there was a woman with black curly hair. And he'd never seen her before in all his life. And yet he says to her, "Brian O'Bronican, come inside." And he did. And he went out and sat down beside the woman with black curly hair. Well, after a while, a big man come up to the woman with black curly hair, and he says, "This wake's getting kind of dull. We think we'll be going into town after a fiddler, and so he can play and we can dance." And the woman with black curly hair says, "Well, no. Why would you be going after a fiddler when the finest fiddler in all of Ireland is sitting right here? It's Brian O'Bronican of Byron Gate." "I'm not a fiddler," says Brian. I've no music in my head, I've no talent in my fingers, no nothing like that. And she says to him, "Would you be making a liar out of me?" And she handed him the fiddle. And Brian stood up and he began to fiddle, and the people began to dance, and they all said it was the best fiddling and the best dancing they'd ever heard in all of Ireland. And after while, the big man come up to the woman with black curly hair, and he says to her, it's coming along about dawn. You think we'll be going into town to get a priest so he can say mass? And the woman with black curly hair says to him, she says, well, why would you be going into town after a priest when the finest priest in all of Ireland is sitting right here? It's Brian O'Rourke of Byron Gate. Says Brian, I'm not a priest. I'm no preaching in the heart. I'm no praying in my head, no nothing like that. And she said to him, would you be making a liar out of me, Brian? And she handed him the prayer book. And Brian began to preach and to pray, and the people all said it was the best preaching and the best praying they'd ever heard in all of Ireland. And then they started forming a procession to carry out the body to the graveyard. And just then the big man come up to the woman with black curly hair, and he says to her, would you look at that? Would you look at how that casket is just a wiggling and a wobbling over there? And it's all on account of we got 3 short men and 1 tall man. We think we'll be going into town to get a sergeant to cut off the tall man's leg so the casket can ride out easy. And the woman with black curly hair said, well now, why would you be going into town after a sergeant when the finest sergeant in all of Ireland is sitting right here? It's Brian O'Rourke of Byron Gate. Oh no, says Brian, I'm not a sergeant. I've no medicine in my head, I've no skill in my fingers, no nothing like that. Well, now, Brian, said the woman with black curly hair, you'll be doing that as well as you did the rest. And she handed him the scalpel, and they brought the tall man up, and Brian cut off his legs and pushed him back together, and he went back and carried out the casket. And sure enough, it rode out just as level as you please. And they formed a procession and followed it out, and last in all the procession was Brian O'Rourke of Byron Gate. And when he reached the stile, going over the wall of the cemetery, just at the top of that stile, a great wind come up, and it picked him up and carried him up and away, and set him down right before the well. And there was his bucket, and the water on it was no more than dry. He picked it up and he took it in the house, and he gave it to the little old man and the little old woman, and the little old man says to him, well now, Brian, have you a story to tell? And Brian said, that I do, and he told him all that had happened to him that day, and they fixed him a fine meal and put him to bed in a fine feather bed. And when he woke up, he was leaning back on those 2 bundles of rocks there at Alton's home. He picked him up and he headed off home. And his wife saw him coming. She said, well now, Brian, you're home early. You must have a story to tell. Well, I'm telling you this story because if you are one who came here thinking that you had no story to tell, just beware that in the blinking of an eye or a gush of a little wind, you may be one who has a story to tell. Long ago and far away across the 9 kingdoms, there lived a king and a queen who ruled wisely and well, and they were beloved by their people who lived in a land of prosperity and peace. But one day, the king got to thinking that he might be better off if he went out and took some more lands for his people. And so he formed himself an army. He fitted it out beautifully, and away they marched to the borders of his country. They crossed over and began to do battle with the king in the kingdom next door. And far from succeeding in taking more land, the king's army was practically demolished. He and the few who were left to live were taken to a dungeon. And all day they were sent out into the fields to work hard and then brought back to that dungeon at night. One day he managed to get a message sent to his queen, and he said to her, take everything we own and sell it and build a ransom and offer it to this king, and perhaps then he will let me go home. But when the queen received the message, she thought, if I sell everything we own, who shall I give the money to take to the king? Who can I trust? And if I sell everything we own, my husband will return to a land that is far from prosperous the way he left it. And so she thought of another plan. She went into her chambers, and without telling anyone, she cut off her hair, and she took a cloak from out of her closet and pulled it over her head, and she took her lute, and she began to walk along the road to that distant country. She picked up with some pilgrims and some merchants who were traveling from city to city, and to them she was a young boy who played the lute. And indeed she did. Every evening she would entertain her traveling companions with music. At last, she made it to that far country where she knew her husband was held prisoner. And she went to the palace, and she took out her lute, just standing there in the courtyard, and she sang, and if you hear me singing within your palace, sire, oh, give, I pray, this happy day, give me my heart's desire, give to me my heart's desire, give to me my heart's desire. And the king heard her. He went over to the window and he called out, young man, come up to my throne room. And the queen did. And the king said to her, won't you stay here and be my court musician? You will have a home for the rest of your life if you so wish. And the queen said, sire, I am a wandering minstrel, and it is my way to journey on from place to place, and yet I will stay here for a few days. And she did. And all day long she sang in the court, and the courtiers thought they had never heard such lovely music. But after a while she went to the king and she said, sire, I must move on. And the king said, name what it is that is your heart's desire. We have enjoyed your music for many days, and I should like to reward you in some day. Well, the queen said, my lord, I am lonely at times on the road, and I wonder if you would give me someone to travel with me, just one of your prisoners. And the king said, of course. And he took her straightway to the dungeon, and she walked around until she saw her own husband. And she said, this is the one I shall choose. And the king stood up and went with her. And they left and directed themselves back to what was their own country. Every day she played and entertained the pilgrims and the merchants that they were traveling with. And not once did the king recognize his own wife. At last they came into the borders of their own country, and the king said to the lute player, I am no ordinary prisoner that you have taken, for I am the king of this land. Won't you come with me to my palace and be my court musician, and I shall reward you greatly. And the lute player said, sire, I am a wandering minstrel, and that is my way, and I must go on. And so they parted ways. The queen headed straightway back to the castle, and the king as well, only the queen got there first because the king, well, if the truth be known, he He got lost and refused to stop and ask for directions. But when he got back to the palace, his courtiers welcomed him heartily. They were so glad to see this man who had been their fine king for so many years. And then the king inquired of his wife, the queen. "Sire," he said, "the day your message arrived, she disappeared and she has not been seen since." What could have happened, thought the king. And at that moment that he was thinking that, the queen appeared, coming out of their chamber door. She had changed back into her regular clothing and came out to rejoice and to welcome her husband back home. But when he saw her, he said, "You faithless queen, I sent you a message. I asked you to sell all that we owned and raise a ransom and come and rescue me. But what? I had to wait until at last a young lute player came along and saved me." Well, while the king and his courtiers were discussing what should be done with the faithless queen, she returned to her room and took off her garb and changed once again into the clothes of a wandering minstrel. And she went outside the window of their palace and she sang, "And if you hear me singing within your palace, sire, oh, give, I pray, this happy day to me, my heart's desire. Give to me my heart's desire. Give to me my heart's desire." And when the king heard that voice, he ran over to the window and he said, "Young man, come up here, come into my palace." And the lute player came inside. And the king welcomed him. He said, This is the lute player who saved my life. Young man, if you will, name what it is that is your heart's desire, for I should like to reward you in some way." And at that, the queen removed the hood of her cloak, and the king's eyes were open. She said, "My lord, I wish only that you would love me and cherish me." And the king was so delighted with his lovely wife. He had a celebration. It was a feast that lasted for 2 weeks. I know. I was there. And the juice from that sweet wine is still